Hi, and welcome to the Performance BENDS one-day course from Survival Skills. I'm Kevin Williams, and I'm going to take you through the thinking and the theory behind these sessions. Now, the first thing I want to say is that I'm taking a very different look at BENDS riding from the vast majority of training in the country. If you look at most motorcycle training courses, they aim to give you better riding skills. I don't do that. Not exclusively anyway. You will learn better machine control techniques on a performance BENDS course, but one of the things that we'll really look at in detail are crashes, because the idea that riders who aren't capable of riding well crash is actually a flawed one. Most crashes actually happen to ordinary and even highly skilled riders. The evidence is that by giving people extra cornering skills, they actually tend to use those skills to ride harder, and they end up having much the same accidents as ordinary riders, the less skilled riders if you like, simply at higher speeds. There's also a significant misunderstanding about where these crashes actually happen. On urban roads, most motorcycle collisions do actually happen at junctions, but on rural roads, the errors are at three places. Junctions where drivers tend to misjudge speed and distance, or the bike is actually just out of sight when the rider is approaching the junction, and where the driver makes his decision, the bike simply can't be seen, and the rider actually is going too fast to take evasive action when they see the problem developing. Corners. What tends to happen on corners is the rider runs out of room, either off the road into the undergrowth on the near side, which doesn't always have the serious consequences. Many riders will have that crash without actually seriously hurting themselves. But if we do the opposite and run wide on a left-hander and into oncoming traffic, then the results are often fatal. The third category of accident is during overtakes, where again it's the rider who makes the misjudgment, and even when we can blame a driver for turning right without looking in the mirror, in reality the rider should never have actually put themselves into that position. They should have predicted that particular possibility from the driver. So the rider errors that we're looking at really are in terms of failure to identify hazards, and what happens next is that once we are caught out by something that we weren't expecting to happen, it leads to something that Keith Code identified quite a few years ago. Keith Code being an American rider coach who runs the Superbike school over there. And he wrote the Twist of the Wrist books that you may have heard of. But what he identified were what he called the survival reactions. And they include freezing, doing nothing basically when you've got time to do something, panic reacting, where we tend to do the wrong thing or we tend to do the right thing but to excess. Big handfuls of front brake being a good example of that. That's why we've got ABS on modern bikes. And we target fixate. We tend to look at where we are going to crash, not at how to get out of trouble. Once you're in trouble, it is very difficult to avoid target fixation. So these survival reactions are the things that cause many crashes, and what triggers them is surprise. When we don't predict what's going to happen next, that is when we run into trouble with these survival reactions. So the underpinning thinking behind survival skills, is why they're called survival skills, is that we plan for things to go wrong rather than expect things to go right. Rather than believing our skills are what's keeping us out of trouble, we actually anticipate things that could go wrong, that the car could pull out, the bend could tighten up, that the vehicle we're overtaking could find somewhere to turn right. So planning for the worst case scenario is absolutely vital. Now, speed is a factor in many crashes. The problem is that as we add speed, we have less time to think and less time to react, and this trades off fairly spectacularly with our stopping distance. If we double our stopping distance, if we double our speed, we actually quadruple our stopping distance. Now think about that. It's a fairly dramatic piece of mathematics, but the interesting thing is the maths works backwards. So if we halve our speed, then our stopping distance is now a quarter of what it was before we slowed down. So basically the ability to pick places to go slow is paramount in better riding. It's not simply skills, it's actually understanding we're losing some speed, we're giving us more time, and being able to make better decisions and having a greater margin for error is crucial. Now, one of the areas where we are most likely to be caught out is from what's called a surprise horizon. Now, this term came from a book by a chap called Stephen Haley called Mind Driving, and a surprise horizon is anywhere a vehicle or a pedestrian or a cyclist or even an animal can pop out from a blind area that we can't see into. A very good one would be a tool hedge that the tractor, the sort of picture that you see in front of you, appears from. That's a still taken from the Perfect Day video, which I suggested you watch. So a surprise horizon is a key point to identify. Advanced riding tends to talk about the limit point as being the furthest bit down the road that you can actually see. It's all very well known where the limit point is, but we actually have to spend more time looking for these surprise horizons, which are on both sides of the road, and to know where they are and what they could possibly hide, then really we need to worry about the limit point. We may never get there if we don't spot a surprise horizon. So we need to see what we can see. Have a look down the road, figure out what's in plain sight, and then look for the areas that we cannot see into. And very often we can spot the things that are blocking our view. Blind crests and tall hedges, buildings, walls, fences, anything like that. Even a group of people standing at the side of a road could be a vision blocker. So once we've spot these vision blockers, then it's easier to detect the surprise horizons that are behind them. And what we need to do then is to think about how we can position to see and be seen. Right, so, okay. And this sets us on the path to planned riding. Now, planned riding takes up 3 stages. First of all, we need to know what the hazard is. We actually have to spot it. So in the picture there, again taken from the Perfect Day video, the van explains on the back that the driver's just about to turn right. So we have to recognize the van first of all as a hazard. We have to understand what that van could do at that junction. So that's what's known as risk assessment. We have to tell ourselves what can go wrong. What's the chances of that van turning right? Well, pretty high. You know, any van can turn right at any location, can't it? And given the fact that it's right over by the white line and the brake lights are on, I'd say that that's a pretty good clue that that vehicle is about to turn, or if it isn't, maybe something in front of it is. So what's the impact on us if things do go wrong? Well, if we hit a van turning right while we're trying to overtake it, that's not great news. So that is our risk assessment. What can go wrong? What's the chance of it going wrong? And how much is it going to hurt us if things do go wrong? So the third stage of our plan is how we manage that risk, how we minimize it. What can we do to mitigate the threat to us? We've talked about slowing down, giving us more time to think, more time to assess, and a shorter stopping distance. That's one way we could change our behaviour. We could hang back and get a better view. We might be able to see what's in front of the van and whether there's a vehicle ahead of it. So there are various things we can do. We can generally change speed and position to open up views, help people see us, and to give us more space. So that's all part of planned riding. So to make that a little bit more formal, a riding system, doesn't matter what you look at, whether it's the observation, signal, maneuver, position, speed, lifesaver, OSM, PSL, which is taught by the DVSA on basic training, or whether it's the ROSPA, IAM, police system of riding, which is information, position, speed, gear, acceleration. They all break down into 3 stages. Search, while we find out what the threat is. Evaluate, when we work out what can go wrong and what we can do about it, and then execute is where we actually change our speed and position to deal with the threat. We need to add a fourth stage there, review. Is the plan actually working? And then it's a good idea to have a plan B to just in case plan A didn't work. So for instance, if we're planning on passing that van up the near side because we think it's turning right, what if it's actually slowing down because there's a vehicle turning right in front of it across our path from the opposite direction? It would probably be not a good idea to do what the rider in the video did, which is accelerate up the inside of the van. I would definitely be taking that fairly slow if I was passing on the near side, and I might even hang back and just wait for the van to turn and then open up the view of the whole road. So there are various things that we can do, but all riding plans, whatever they're called, have these three stages: search, evaluate, execute, and then I would add review to that. Okay, bit of basic riding technique now. It all starts with being in the right position. If we're not in the right position to control the machine, it makes it generally more tricky. So how do we get ourselves into the right place? Well, we use what I call the brace position, and that all stems from having a good, secure position locked onto the machine, and that's where our legs come in, and specifically our knees, because it's our knees that allow us to lock in to the petrol tank. If you've ever ridden a horse, that's how you do it. You use your knees to control the horse and control your body movement on that animal. What you don't do is hang on to the reins for dear life, because they're limp and floppy bits of leather and they're no bloody use for that at all. So the handlebars, we need to treat those somewhat like the reins of a horse. Our grip on the bars needs to be secure, but everything from our wrists right up to our elbows, our shoulders, and even the top half of our spine needs to be flexible. The bit that is locked into the motorcycle is the knees, and so the hips are in a firm position. So basically we have to have loose arms, loose shoulders, and that also helps our neck stay loose, incidentally. So a good way of detecting tenseness as you're riding is just to flap your elbows. Find out what your elbows are doing. If they're floppy, you're keeping a nice light grip. If they're stiff, then you're probably leaning on the handlebars. Now, the reason we don't want to lean on the handlebars is it really destroys our ability to control the bike. Have a look at the machine. It's got fairly low bars, so down at pretty much at pelvis level. So the rider's in a forward lean. If we lean on the handlebars, it makes it very, very difficult to steer the bike. In fact, we can try counter steering, which I'll talk about in a moment. If we push on one side of the bars to try to counter steer the bike, if we're leaning on the bar on the other side with the opposite arm, the bars simply won't move, and then the bike refuses to go around the corner. A lot of riders will blame the motorcycle for being unresponsive. In fact, it's the rider stopping it doing its thing. The other reasons for keeping a light grip on the bars is what happens on bumpy surfaces and on windy days. If we get blown around or bounced around by a bad road surface because we're not gripping the tank with our knees, then what we'll tend to do is feed all those bumps and gusts straight back into the handlebars, and we'll make the machine handle worse than it would otherwise have done. If we lock into the tank with the knees and keep the top half of the body all nice and flexible, then we can sway around on the machine, but independently of our hands on the bars. Okay, the other time that we need a good a grip on the tank with our knees is under braking, to stop our body weight being thrown forward onto the handlebars, because again that will destroy our control of the machine, and it will also take away feel of what the front tyre is doing on the road surface. And finally, acceleration. Gripping the tank with your knees will help you stop sliding back down the seat if you accelerate hard. So this brace position is a key part of getting a good system of control over the machine. Right, counter steering. Counter-steering's been around for a long time. It's been around ever since somebody put one wheel in front of the other and called it a bicycle, in fact. And the very first article that described counter-steering that anybody knows about was actually written by one of Oliver and Wilbur Wright. I can never remember which one. You may remember they built aeroplanes round about the turn of the century. Well, shortly before they built aeroplanes, they built bicycles. And one of them wrote an article for an American engineering journal and described this system of steering a bicycle. And basically what he described was counter-steering. Where if you push on the left handlebar and push it forward and away from you, then the bike will steer to the left, and if you push the right handlebar away from you, so the bike will steer to the right. So that is counter steering in a nutshell. What else do you need to know? Counter steering causes the bike to roll. Roll is the movement where the bike starts to lean. So we need to know the difference between the three terms. Steering is what creates roll. Roll is what happens when you steer, and it results in the bike leaning. So there are three different phenomena there. The important thing to know is that the harder you push the bar, the faster the bike rolls, and therefore the quicker it achieves the lean angle that you're looking for. And once you've achieved that lean angle more quickly, the bike changes direction faster. So a firmer press on the bars is how you get the bike to change direction more quickly. Okay, now a couple of other things. This is something we'll try out on the road. You push the bar to generate the roll, but if you didn't stop pushing, the bike will keep rolling and eventually it will be lying on its side. So we don't do that. We actually ease back on the pressure, and what you'll find is that the bars then turn into the corner. And so now with the wheels angled into the turn, that's when the bike rolls around in a nice circle. But we need to maintain a bit of pressure to hold bars in that position. If we don't, what happens is the bike actually sits upright again. Bikes are designed to be straight line stable. Take the hands off the bars, they'll go straight. If you're leaning over when you take your hands off the bars, they will lift themselves up out of the turn and go straight. They may wobble a couple of times, but they will return to the upright position once the machine's rolling at more than about 10 or 12 miles an hour. So bikes are designed to be straight line stable. So to come out of the corner, we simply remove all this counter steering pressure on the handlebar, and the bike steers itself straight. So push to lean, ease off some of the pressure to hold the lean, and then relax all the pressure altogether, and the bike will steer itself upright. And that's how counter steering works. Right, okay. Having steered the bike, it's a good idea to know how to slow it down again. And now we have some options. We can use engine braking simply by closing the throttle. We can use the brakes, and if we're braking from any kind of speed, we should be using both brakes together. Front brake first and then rear brake a moment later is the conventional way to brake. And the front brake does most of the work when we're braking from high speed. If you take a look at your brakes on the bike, you'll see the two front discs on most machines and a big disc with at the back you just use one tiny disc. So the front brakes are much most powerful ones, and those are the straight line stoppers. But use both of them together. A bit of back brake helps stabilize the bike a little. In awkward situations such as slow control, or maybe trying to maintain speed around the downhill corner, then that's when the rear brake comes into its own. But it's not really a brake that we should be trying to use to lose big speed. The exact brake force distributed front and rear varies from machine to machine. If you've got a sports bike, which is a fairly short wheelbase, fairly forward sort of riding position, and the weight distributed fairly far forward, if you can use a lot of front brake on those, and you won't get much out of the back brake before it's in the rear wheels in mid-air. If you're riding a long wheelbase cruiser or tourer, particularly with somebody sat on the back, then you can use both brakes because the extra weight is holding the rear of the bike down. So the braking force differs depending on the machine that you're riding. There are also linked brakes on some bikes, and that will kind of the designer there has done the calculations for you, but again, you should still be using both brakes even if you have linked brakes. And last thing to say about braking is you probably have ABS on a modern machine, and do find out how it works. There are a few bikes with only single channel ABS on the front brake. Virtually all bikes do have dual channel ABS front and rear, but it is a good idea to find out what it feels like when it kicks in. Many riders have never activated their ABS. If it does kick in, hold the ABS, hold the brake where it is, and just let the ABS sort it out. It will stop you faster than releasing and reapplying, which was the technique we used to use on non-ABS bikes if you lock a wheel. Okay, what about acceleration? Something I meant to mention before I come on to acceleration, that is if we brake hard, we should be upright in a straight line. Much easier to get the grip on the tyre if we're only using it for braking than if we are trying to mix and match by braking into a corner. So similarly, if we're accelerating, we want to do the same. We want to get the power on when we're upright and not when we're leant over. There are two reasons for this. The first is down to grip on the tyre. If the bike is leaning, the grip of the tyre is being split two ways between controlling the lean and accelerating, and we'll run out of tyre grip rather more quickly if we're leaning than we will if we're upright, so we can't accelerate as hard. But that also of course means that if we do lose grip, the rear will go out from under us very quickly. Now traction control should sort that out, but of course when traction control kicks in, for most riders the response is to actually shut the throttle, which causes the bike to twitch upright anyway. So the ideal situation, even with traction control, is get the bike around the corner, get it upright, then open the throttle. If the bike wheel spins, if you haven't got traction control, no big deal if you're upright, and if the traction control kicks in, equally no big deal if the bike is upright. The second thing to understand is that the moment we start to accelerate around a corner, even if the tyre grips, we will run wide, simply because a bike that's travelling faster at the same lean angle needs a bigger radius of turn. The only way to counter that is to lean over harder. So forget those magazine articles that talk about powering through the second half of a turn. You only do that if the turn is opening out, and as we've got usually so little room on the road, we're not on a racetrack, the best thing to do is actually get the bike steered upright and then twist the throttle. So braking and accelerating, the best thing to do is to separate those from corners and do them either side of the bendy bit. Next thing to say is let the engine rev. Many riders try to get out through the gearbox too early. Try and find a gear which allows you to ride a little bit like an automatic, so you're minimizing gear changing. You'll get more engine braking when you shut the throttle, you'll get better response when you open the throttle, but most importantly you won't actually be needing to change gear mid-maneuver, and that applies equally around a roundabout as it does in the middle of a corner. Now here's a technique from the Australians. One of the things that they teach their riders to do is to set up the brakes, and basically what we're doing here is we're rolling the throttle off and we're applying the front brake lightly, so lightly in fact all we're really doing is taking the slack out of the lever. And that's similarly, we're doing that at the rear as well. We get our toe over the rear brake lever and again just take the slack out of the system. Now it does two things. It means you can go straight into positive braking, but it also sets your brain up to think about why you might need to slow down. It helps avoid surprises at things like junctions or unexpectedly sharp bends. Now this technique is rather frowned upon by a lot of advanced groups over here, but as I say, the Australians teach it out there, and I've come to use it and I've come to like it. Basically, if you set the brakes up anytime you're not sure what's going to happen next, then you're in a better place to deal with an emergency than if you are waiting to see what happens and then have to go for the brakes. You'll be going for the brakes later and you'll be going for the brakes harder, which means a harsher, more sudden response from the motorcycle itself. Okay, so how do things go wrong in corners? Well, the answer is that they are a bit different from something like a junction crash, where generally one person makes one catastrophic error. Bend crashes tend to be what the American Air Force delightfully call clusterfucks. These are a succession of minor errors. Now, the interesting thing about clusterfuck errors is, first of all, they are often predictable. That is the sort of error that we have all made before. So if we made them before, we could make them again. So they're predictable. They're also avoidable, because if we know they're predictable, we should be able to figure out how not to make those mistakes. Even more interesting, many of these errors are actually correctable. So have a think about it. If we brake a bit too late for a corner, how do we deal with that? Well, we just brake a bit harder. If we run in a bit too hot to a corner, what do? Well, we break the rule I just told you about braking upright, and we carry our deceleration into the first part of the corner. It's not ideal, but it works. One of the errors that many riders make when they run in a bit too hot into a corner is that they then steer into the turn too early. So they start to cut across the road or across the lane, and they also steer slowly. We don't actually make the direction change very positive. Now, what tends to happen is the rider tends to be looking at where they're going to crash, so they target fixate, and that's when riders actually run wide on the way out of a bend. So, and all this starts with a lack of preparation. It all comes back to the planning stage: the search, evaluate, and execute. This is all execution, braking, steering, changing, choosing your line and changing direction. That's all the execution phase of the system I was talking about. So what's gone wrong is the search and evaluate phases earlier. If we get those right, then we're far less likely to make these clusterfuck errors. The problem is, as I say, that most of these are correctable. Right up till target fixation, we can deal with those errors, but once we're target fixated, it's really difficult to get out of trouble. Okay, so the turn in too early, run wide later error. It has two bad effects. The first is that you might meet a vehicle part way around the corner. I think you can see what will happen there. Generally speaking, I find that the trainees who have a head on their shoulders are the ones who are most likely to complete a course successfully. So a wider line to the outside of the turn would avoid the coach. But the second problem is possibly less obvious. If the rider is going to avoid that coach, he's got to pick the bike up, and now the line that he's going to be following is going to take him into and quite likely over the barrier. So a early turn-in can have real problems mid-corner and in the way out of the bend. Okay, what about too wide on a left-hander? Well, we're often told we should sit out near the centre line to see round a left-hand bend, and in fact we will be doing some of that on the training, but we don't want to get so close we come into conflict with oncoming vehicles, because the danger is that if a big coach comes towards us, like this one here, again straddling the centre line, the first thing the rider is going to do is target fixate on the coach. And in fact, the correct answer, of course, is not to target fixate, but to think, where am I going to go next? And that is to tighten the line. And this is where counter steering comes in. We must be able to push that inside handlebar, the left bar, with confidence to drop the bike over further into the corner and thus steer away from the coach. The catastrophic error in this case, following counter steering, is often to brake. Braking at this point simply stands the bike up. Even a BMW with telelever suspension will sit up if you hit the brakes, and then it'll run straight into the coach. That is a killer crash on many corners. Okay, so here is the survival skills point and squirt approach to corners. The first thing we need to do is set ourselves up on the vision line. Remember, ask yourself what you can see around the bend, where the blind areas are, and work out what's blocking your view. And ask yourself, can I see further around this corner if I sit nearer the center line? And then on a right-hander, we'd be thinking the other way round. We'd be nearer the curb and hopefully seeing further around a right hand. But we have to ask ourselves, is this a safe place to be? Out near the centre line, we have to be fairly confident we're not going to meet that coach coming the other way. And if we're near the curb side of the on a right hand bend, we also need to be fairly confident we're not going to meet a tractor popping out of a hedge. But if we can get this view, we can move onto this vision line and help us see further ahead. So then evaluate the road, work out what you're looking at. This is where understanding what you're seeing comes in. The police roadcraft manual makes a lot of use of clues. They'll be talking about the lines of hedgerows, the lines of telegraph poles, trees, routes, being able to see movements of other vehicles around the corner somewhere, maybe spotting skid marks on the road, which will all give you clues about what's going on ahead. But some of the simplest pieces of information are simply overlooked, they're ignored, and that is the language of the road that the highway engineer puts out there for you. The hazard line. The hazard line is the long white paint markings with the short gaps between them, and they simply tell you there's a hazard. But they do a little bit more than that. They also help you judge the sharpness of the corner. Have a look at the number of white lines you can see disappearing around the corner. From the moment the white line starts to curve, you can only see 1, 2, 3, 4 white lines. That's a fairly sharp deviation. If you can see half a dozen, it's a moderate deviation. If you can see a dozen of white lines vanishing, then it's hardly a kink at all. So have a look at the white lines. That'll just give you a very, very simple measure of the sharpness of the bend. The triangular warning sign is there for a reason as well. It's usually put up in response to serious accidents. So the minute you see a triangular warning sign, expect that the bend is deceptive. Expect that it's fooled other people. Maybe it's on the end of a long straight. Maybe it's just sharper than all the other bends you've been round. We don't know, but there's something about that corner which will catch you out if you're not careful. Have a look at the chevrons. The chevrons literally tell you where to crash. If the warning sign tells you there is a dangerous bend ahead and that you could crash, the chevrons actually flag up the places where people tend to fall off the road. If you look at the signs, they're very often flattened and in a ditch, which tells you that people have hit them. And the second thing that you'll notice is that some are made of plastic rather than aluminium poles and or steel poles rather than aluminium sheet, and that's because motorcyclists keep running into them. Similarly, you can use road signs to see junctions. Again, you get the hazard line telling you there is some general hazard ahead, so start looking for the other clues, the triangular warning signs that tell you whether it's a side turning or a crossroads or some other combination like a junction on a bend or a staggered crossroads. And look out for the paint markings at the near side which tell you whether it's a stop or a give way junction. That's useful to know. Stop junction, the driver probably can't see out of it, so it might start to emerge in front of you while he looks. The finger post, that's the pointy post that tells you that Sleepy Hollow is half a mile down that lane. You may not be interested in Sleepy Hollow, but the very fact that you can see the finger post tells you where the junction is that the junction warning sign has alerted you to. You now know the place you will crash. Okay, so for corners, then execute what we're going to do next, and the key is to be in the right place at the right time and at the right speed. So what that means for bends is slow in, cautiously round, because we may have to change our line, we may have to stop even mid-corner, and then fast out only when we can see it's clear. Remember what I said about getting all the braking done in a straight line. So any deceleration, rolling the throttle off or applying the brakes needs to be completed nice and early. And ideally, my tip here is have a look at the centre line and count back 3 straight white lines. Draw an imaginary line across the road there and make that the point at which you are aiming to be off the brakes and getting back on the throttle. That does 2 things. It allows you to get the bike steady and upright on the throttle before you try to steer, and it allows you to look around the corner. It releases your brain from worrying about will you stop in time to where does the road go next, and it does a third thing, actually 3 things it does. Is it gives you a buffer zone. If you get it all horribly wrong, you've still got 30 odd meters to brake. But if you try to brake right to the point where the bend starts, then the danger is if you get it wrong, you're now braking into the corner. So get all the brakes done upright and try to get them off 3 straight lines before you arrive at the first curved line, which tells you the bend is starting. Around the corner itself, you simply want to try to keep a fairly steady throttle. So where the yellow line and the green line are, you would use steady throttle almost to the end of the green line. When the bike is upright, which is the second white line, fast out, that's where you can twist the throttle hard. But what we don't want to do is try to power through the corner for the reasons I've already explained. Okay, so the point and squirt system modifies something that Keith Code talks about, which are reference points, and I've adapted these to use on the road. We have 3 reference points in a bend that we need to worry about, and we read them backwards. The exit controls the whole of the corner. Once you're at the exit, you've got the power on, you're pointed at the next bit of road, whatever it is, another bend, a straight or some other hazard, and you can choose whether or not you're going to accelerate away. But you can only see that point from the turn-in point. Now the turn-in point is somewhere around where the turn-in arrow is. From that point you've got a clear view down both sides of the road. Now you probably get a little bit of early warning if you look at the blue line that runs sort of across the corner, just in the top of the green arrow there. That line of sight probably gives you enough clues that you're reaching the turn-in point, because you'll see the line down the middle of the road go straight and you'll see the hedge on the other side of the road straighten up. But if you take it just a little bit further to the turn-in point itself, then you can actually see both sides of the road before you commit yourself to turning tighter across the lane and straightening out the final half of the corner. What that allows you to do is avoid turning tighter and finding that coach coming round the corner out of the blind spot that you hadn't opened up. So again, remember the vision blockers exist on the insides of corners too. And now we know the turn-in point. The only other point we need to worry about is the entry point to the corner, and that's simply where we are forced to steer. So all bends, if you decide to cut across the corner and straighten it out, we have that turn-in point and the exit point which are linked together. The entry and the exit are always fixed. The turn-in point moves depending on the shape and the view through the corner. So, okay, did I mention that apex? No, I didn't. The apex isn't important on the road. People talk about it on the track, but in fact it's simply the point closest to the inside of the corner between the turn-in and exit. We don't really need to worry about it on the road. Okay, useful technique to understand is that the throttle is a good key to working out whether we got the bend right. If we're able to keep the power on gently right round the corner, we probably assessed the bend right, we probably got onto a good line. If we're shutting the throttle into the bends, then we're running in too hot. That's possibly because we didn't get the brakes on early enough, or because we misjudged the bend and it's turned out to be a bit tighter than we expected. If we're shutting the throttle mid-corner, or worse, as the rider in the photo is doing, which is braking in the middle of a corner, then we are offline, and that means we probably turned in too early, or we misjudged our radius of the turn, and again we thought the turn wasn't going round as far as it did, and we probably turned in too early. Too slow in a corner, well, is that much of a problem? Not really, we can always accelerate out of the corner, but too fast into a bend almost always is an issue. Right, so here we come to sum up then. Last but one slide. Check out your vision line to maximize your view into the corner. Remember to ask what you can see, what you can't see, and put yourself in a position with a better view if safe. And on that right hand bend in the diagram, that means over by the near side. Go into the corner asking yourself, where is the way out of the bend? Look for that exit where you're harder on the power. So Use the signs and markings to judge where the bend is going and how sharp it's likely to be, and to get some heads up warning about deceptive bends, and then use those reference points: entry, turn in and exit. And finally put that all together. Slow, look, lean, roll. So slow is where we are decelerating. The look stage is where we're waiting to search out that exit. The lean is where we apply a little bit more counter steering and drop the bike into the turn a little bit harder to straighten the rest of the bend out, and that's when we see the exit to the corner, so that's our turning point, remember. And then finally we roll the throttle on harder on the way out of the bend. Right, so that is the survival skills point and squirt system in a nutshell, and that's it basically. If we use that system, it gives you the basis for virtually every corner on the road. So enjoy your ride, but remember, you can only ride smarter if you are prepared to spend a bit of time reading and reacting to these clues, and then practicing and building in margins for error. Right, thank you very much. I'll see you on the day on the course. Bye for now from Kevin Williams.